chop, 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 chop. Once upon a time, there was a king. He was not so much a king as a chief, for his domain was very small indeed. Anyways, the subjects of this king chief were very poor, and a lot of them have been starving for a while. This was because the majority of the produce from their farms go to the king as tributaries and payments for their use of his land. One day, the king, sensing desperation and fearing revolt, had an idea. He announced that there is to be a feast. At this feast, which will be hosted by him, there will be a variety of meals, which were amongst the most common in the land. Following this one great feast, every day for the next 10 years, there will be a smaller feast in which the only meal to be had will be that which was the most sought after in the very first great feast. This was, of course, a bit of mixed news for the subjects. On the one hand, free meals for a decade, potentially putting an end to all the hunger in the land. On the other, supposing the king really does keep his word, how do they ensure that the one meal that they will collectively eat for the next 10 years is one that is both adequately nutritious and palatable to every one of them? What if the forest dwellers, for example, selfishly go for their beloved dark leaf soup, which although is known to be rich in nutrients, is abhorred by everyone else for being unpalatable? What if the people of the plains all order for the delicious gritty soup that is beloved to them, which is, by the way, also notorious for being the nutritional equivalent of white sand? How can Odi, who is one of these subjects, be sure that the whole affair is not a ruse or an elaborate prank? And will he not be better off sitting out at least the very first feast and then enjoying the subsequent ones after the decision has been made by others? There is, as you have seen, a lot to gain here, but there is also a lot to lose potentially. What then is the best course of action for these subjects to ensure not only their survival but prosperity in the coming decade of daily feasting? Hello there, I am the scientist and you are welcome to this episode of 0100 Niger. The little story you heard at the beginning there is a little thought exercise, and I would like you to take a minute to think about the predicament of the king's subject and suggest a way for them to achieve the optimal results in their situation. Alright, time up. I fashioned that story as an example scenario for the concept of the tragedy of the commons as it can be applied to elections. The whole story is, as you can see, of course, an anecdote for an electoral process. The one great feast is an analogy for the election or election day. The different meal choices stand for the contesting candidates, and so on and so on. Alright, I know, this is all a bit too obvious for the philosophers and economists and scientists in the audience, and there might even be one or more holes and inappropriatenesses in the story, but let us overlook all that for a bit here. For the rest of us that are unfamiliar with the subject, the tragedy of the commons is a concept that was first put together in an essay by a British economist in the 19th century. Simply put, the tragedy of the commons describes a situation in which individuals in a community with open, unrestricted access to a shared resource will, by acting in their self-interest and without regard to the common good of the collective, cause the depletion of that resource to the detriment of all users. In the original essay, the concept was first used to describe the effects of unregulated grazing on common land. The hypothetical example used in the essay is the case of cattle herders who share a common piece of land for use in grazing their cattle. There is a specified number of cattle each herder is allowed to graze on the land at the same time. If a herder were to put more than his allotted number of cattle on the land, he stands to gain greater yield as his cattle will grow bigger and therefore fetch higher prices in the market. But the entire group suffers as a result of the overgrazing, And over time, as small herders emulate the same selfish behavior, the entire common land will be depleted of feed for their cattle, leading to great loss for all the herders. Hence, tragedy of the commons. The concept is a heavily discussed one, and it has seen numerous applications in various fields, including economics, politics, ecology, and sociology. Perhaps, if there is enough interest in it, we might discuss some of its interpretations, contestations, and interesting examples in a future episode. For now, though, we'll be looking at how understanding the concept could help us decide to be more proactive in the electoral process, particularly in these upcoming general elections. Back to our little story from the beginning of the episode. At first glance, it will seem that at least a good portion of the kingdom's populace will be in for some real tough time in the course of the following decade. There are numerous ways in which the subjects, individually or in groups, could act in self-interest, and there are equally numerous reasons they might decide to do so, all with their various undesirable consequences. But by acting with the collective good of the community in mind, the subjects could ensure not only their collective survival, but probably too, without sacrificing the ability to take pleasure in eating a meal. For instance, supposing individual subjects on their own or in a group were to recognize a meal with just the right mixture of nourishment and acceptability to all the groups in the kingdom. For example, if the said kingdom were to be a stand-in for Nigeria, a good choice for such a meal could be, say, for instance, pounded yam with egusi soup. I don't know. Following such identification, however, once such a meal has been identified, the proponents will then have the job of making their discovery known to others so as to generate popular support for it, or potentially to generate a consensus on the meal choice they will ask for at the great feast, thus ensuring maximal satisfaction for the most number of people and reasonable tolerance for the rest over the next decade. It will not do, however, for one of the subjects to make the discovery and keep it to themselves, probably in the hope that others will come to the same conclusions independently, or to get overwhelmed by the burden of choice and decide to wait out the first feast and to leave the decision making to others. Either of these behaviors, if replicated by enough people, will have potentially deleterious consequences, not just for the individuals making the choice, but as you have seen, for the group as a whole. Similarly, following from that analogy, in a real-world election with me, for example, as an individual citizen, I might have some personal incentive for voting for a particular candidate in the election, say maybe because they paid me to do so, or maybe because they are personally known to me or are from the same region as I am. All these are potential selfish reasons for me to vote for them. If, however, I do vote for them without consideration of whether or not they are right for the position, then I have acted against the common good of my fellow citizens, myself included amongst them. And with that behavior replicated by enough people, we will all share in all the harmful consequences that result from making such a choice. Also, if I were to objectively identify an ideal candidate, then acting with the collective good in mind, I would have to share that discovery with others and engage with them meaningfully in order to potentially give more weight to my position. So if I believe that the candidate I identified is the best for the position, hopefully, if enough people are able to come to the same conclusion through me sharing my discovery with them, either they come to the same conclusion independently or being convinced by my proposition, and we all make the right choices in the elections, then we come to a collective good at the end of it. Now, going to one of the issues concerning elections, that a good understanding of the concept of the tragedy of the commons could help to avert or overcome eventually, is the issue of voter apathy. Now, this is when people show a lack of enthusiasm or even general disinterest in the electoral process. There are various reasons people might feel this way, and this include that they might think, for example, that their individual vote is inconsequential in the grand scheme of things, or that their preferred candidate has little chances of winning in the elections, or they might just be lacking in trust in the political system. However, when a large portion of the population does not vote, it can lead to a situation where the outcome of the election is not representative of the will of the majority of citizens. This can result in policies and leaders that are not in the best interests of the country as a whole. In this way, voter apathy and the resulting low voter turnout can be seen as a tragedy of the commons, as individual voters acting in their self-interest to not participate in the election can lead to a suboptimal outcome for the entire community, in this case the country, right? By understanding the concept of the tragedy of the commons and therefore acting in the interest of the common good, many of these concerns are addressed. Now, to conclude, I will have to say that I understand that some of the scenarios presented in this episode are at times largely oversimplifications of real-world events. But as this is not intended to be a particularly comprehensive discussion on the concept, certain such liberties had to be taken. However, I do hope that the episode will have served the purpose of introducing you, my dear listener, to this interesting concept, and that with that, it could help our collective cause of creating a better Nigeria and a better global society. Remember to vote wisely and in good faith. Engage in meaningful, respectful discourse with others as you go about carrying out your civic duty and fulfilling your responsibility. Now, lastly, you can send a message to the podcast in the comment section if you're listening on AudioMac or on Anchor. Otherwise, you can reach out to us on our Facebook page or on Twitter at 0100Niger, spelled at 0100 digits, right? 0100 Niger. Or you can tweet at me personally, Leftist Scientist. I am at Leftist Science on Twitter. Remember to like the episode and to follow the podcast on whatever platform you're listening on. We are live on AudioMac, Anchor, Spotify, and YouTube. Thanks for listening to all this far. This is the Scientist signing out, saying thank you and catch you on the next episode.
Water of Africa.